Tempest and Teapot, Political Combat in Antebellum Rhode Island with scholar Erik J. I'm Elizabeth Sulak, Director of Public Programs for the Newport Historical Society. This year marks the 180th anniversary of the Dorr Rebellion, which is considered the most significant constitutional and political event to occur in Rhode Island history. During tonight's lecture, Dr. Chaput will explore the life of Thomas Wilson Dorr and his attempt to overturn Rhode Island's existing government in the spring of 1842. He will focus heavily on the numerous Newport connections to the story of Dorr's attempt at extralegal reform, including a lengthy trial that led to his imprisonment in 1844. A native Rhode Islander, Erik Chaput teaches at Providence College and at Western Reserve Academy. He holds a doctorate in American history from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, and he is the author of The People's Martyr, Thomas Wilson Dorr and his 1842 Rhode Island Rebellion, which is available at newporthistoryshop.com. Dr. Chaput is the co-creator with historian Rusty Simone of the award-winning Dorr Rebellion project website. In addition to his work on Rhode Island history, Dr. Chaput has published numerous articles on anti-slavery politics in the Civil War era.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be with you virtually. I wish I could do this in person, but hopefully in the near future I can get back to Rhode Island. As Elizabeth mentioned, I am currently in Ohio. I'm at Western Reserve, coming to you right now from Western Reserve Academy in Hudson, which is just south of Cleveland by about 35 minutes. But it's a true honor. When my book came out in 2013, I had the opportunity to give a talk at the Colony House, and I want to thank Elizabeth for that for many years ago, and to my friend Bert Lippincott, who I'll mention in certain points some of the material that's in the possession of the Newport Historical Society that was instrumental for me in writing the book, and also for any teachers on the call at the end, I hope in the Q&A that we can talk a little bit about the Dorr Rebellion project website that I've had the privilege to be connected to for the last decade, that's sponsored by Providence College, and we've done some recent updates for that. It's all aimed at teachers. So once again, if you're any educator on the call, please hang on, and I'd love to chat with you at the end about teaching and show you this cool website that Providence College helped to put together over a decade ago. And we've done about 4 updates to the site, and working on a 5th update right now to bring even more material, to help teachers get this material into the classroom. So I'm going to share my screen right now and get underway here. Once again, please do not hesitate to drop things into the chat room. It'd be a privilege to kind of hang on a little bit longer here tonight and to have a chance to have a dialogue about the Dorr Rebellion or other aspects of American history that I will raise tonight. So let me start here. I'm going to start in 1844. Elizabeth mentioned a moment ago the trial of Dorr, so I think it's a good place to kind of begin this evening a little bit in the Colony House. So in June of 1844, in the upper chambers of the Colony House in Newport's famed Washington Square, Thomas Wilson Dorr stood trial for treason. 2 years earlier, Dorr forcibly tried to implement the People's Constitution, a document under which he was elected governor and that he believed had replaced the antiquated colonial charter from 1663. Prior to Dorr's election as the people's governor in April of 1842, Chief Justice Job Durfee had departed from the rules of judicial propriety and toward the state, speaking out against the People's Constitution. Now, Durfee, a Tiverton native, had the responsibilities of presiding over a trial that could very well end with a trip to the gallows for Dorr. Dorr was on trial, facing the judge that just weeks before had sentenced the Irish immigrant John Gordon to the gallows for the murder of Amasa Sprague, a wealthy Cranston industrialist. Dorr was well acquainted with Job Durfee. In the 1830s, he appeared before him numerous times as an attorney in high-profile cases. In 1833, as I was just mentioning to Elizabeth a few moments ago, and I've done quite a bit of work on this, and hopefully to have it in print soon, Dorr was a lawyer actually hired by the state in a sensational murder trial, and Durfee was the judge. It was a trial that was even more shocking for those of you who might know anything about the Avery, the horrible haystack murder of that same year. This trial took place a little bit later in 1833 and is certainly not as well known as that. trial, the horrible haystack murder, the trial of Ephraim Avery. But Dorr participated in numerous murder trials and other high-profile cases in his time as an attorney, but certainly none more than this trial of Francis Leach for the murder of Sally Burdick. Dorr knew, though, as he was in 1844 in front of Durfee, that his chances maybe of walking out of that courtroom a free man were not that good. There was little room for doubt about the strength of Dorr's conviction that citizens had the right to alter or abolish their frame of government, and indeed at the trial, he said it repeatedly. According to Dorr, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the success of the revolution itself meant that the right to revolution was an inherent right in the people, which they could at all times peacefully exercise. Dorr took the opportunity in the trial once again to espouse his political ideology, which he was very consistent about from 1840 onward. And in some ways, it resembles how John Brown approached his trial in 1859 after his failed attempt and raid at Harper's Ferry. Of course, Dorr would survive and not be executed, and Brown would be, though he would be convicted. It mattered little, however, for Chief Justice Job Durfee's charge to the jury left no room for debate. It may be, gentlemen, that he really believed himself to be the governor of this state and that he acted throughout under this delusion. However, it is no defense to an indictment for the violation of any law for the defendant to come to court and say, I thought that I was but exercising a constitutional right, and claim an acquittal on the grounds that I made a mistake. Durfee said there was no doubt that Dorr's actions constituted a levying of war. Dorr was found guilty and was sent to Providence by ferry on June 27th, 1844, where he entered the new state prison on the Cove, and he had a number. This is Dorr's famous from 1844 as his trial became connected to the presidential election of that year. But Dorr in prison was known as prisoner number 56. This is from a collection at the John Hay Library. During his time in prison, on an interesting side note, he had a lot of time and he painted these exquisite hand fans, which we have on the Dorr Rebellion Project website. And these are owned by RISD. I think it's important to point out early in our time this evening that the citizens of Newport County played a significant role in both the origins and the course of Rhode Island's crisis in constitutionalism. The Dorr Rebellion came to an official end at the Colony House in many ways, but the citizens of Newport County played a role both in the origins and the course of Rhode Island's crisis in constitutionalism. Duty Pierce, one of Dorr's closest political allies, whose papers are meticulously preserved at the Newport Historical Society, and I had the privilege of looking at them with the aid of Bert Lippincott, the wonderful archivist at Newport Historical. Pierce was a prominent attorney, former U.S. congressman of 12 years in Washington. He was a prominent Whig, former state attorney general. And once again, his papers are preserved at the Newport Historical Society. And a new project that I'm working on, an update to the Dorr Rebellion Project website. Pierce is a character in our how we are chronicling the gag rule debate, not only at the national level. The gag rule prevented essentially petitions from being fully debated and really read out on the floor of Congress if they dealt with slavery. At the state level, there was also significant discussions about the gag rule in 1837 and 38 and 39. And we're looking at Duty Pierce as a central player because he was in Congress at this point as a representative, but also was writing about this to other folks in the state. As we'll get into tonight, the Rhode Island Suffrage Association and Thomas Wilson Dorr were responding to another Newport, famous Newport politician, Benjamin Hazard, who nearly single-handedly prevented Rhode Island from adopting a modern constitution. Born in Middletown in 1770, Hazard represented Newport in the General Assembly for 31 years. Once again, Hazard is also a key player in the update that we're working on for the Dorr Rebellion Project website, as Hazard supported the gag rule and espoused some very strict pro-slavery rhetoric on the floor of the Rhode Island Assembly that was really no different that you would see from a slaveholder from South Carolina. In May 1842, Newport Representative Richard K. Randolph played a crucial role in derailing Dorr's hopes of garnering federal support. The Virginia-born Randolph was married to a famous Newporter, Anna Marie Lyman. Finally, Newport's sizable militia was always at the ready to board the ferry to Providence to put down militia units that were loyal to Thomas Dorr. But we're here tonight to learn a bit more about a man who was referred to as Wilson by his siblings. So who was Thomas Wilson Dorr? He was born into wealth and privilege in 1805. Thomas Dorr seemed as a young man destined to take his place among Rhode Island's upper echelon. He studied at Phillips Exeter Academy, a boarding school in New Hampshire, one of the most prestigious boarding schools at the time that Dorr went to it, and certainly today. He went on to Harvard and then Columbia Law. It seemed that he was destined to lead a life of leisure and civic pursuits. He would certainly earn his place in the history books, but it was not quite in the way that his father, Sullivan, and his mother, Lydia, had hoped. In the eyes of the city's elite, in the eyes of Providence's elite, by 1842, the year of the rebellion, the 36-year-old Thomas Dorr was a sanctimonious, deluded demagogue bent on destruction. This comes out so clearly as you read these letters that are preserved not only at the Newport Historical Society, but around Historical Society and the John Hay Library. Let me read a portion of a letter here for a moment from Lydia and Sullivan Dorr writing to their son, and that's an image of Sullivan on the screen. Sullivan Dorr and Lydia both said, "It grieves us to the heart to know that a son of ours arrived at so mature in age and so well versed in the laws of his country should be a participant in acts calculated to bring the state into destruction, arouse passions which you cannot allay, and which, God forbid, produce civil strife attended with bloodshed and murder. We beseech you, we pray you to pause before you pass the Rubicon and become engulfed in political criminal degradation, where our feeble prayers will not avail to save you from disgrace and ruin." Dorr's parents really regarded him in some ways as a one-man bonfire of the vanity. So why Rhode Island? Why 1842 and why Thomas Dorr? This is an image of Dorr's mother, Lydia, from the Rhode Island, from RISD. So the origins of what became known as Dorr's Rebellion lay deep in the state's history. The political culture of Rhode Island was certainly unique. Democracy flourished in Rhode Island under the 1663 colonial charter granted by King Charles II. However, restrictive franchise clauses based on stringent property qualifications prevented new waves of immigrants, mostly Irish Catholics, in the 1820s and 30s from entering the body politic. The charter restricted suffrage to those men possessing real estate, a figure set in the year 1798 at $134, thereby disenfranchising most of the population from the commercial and manufacturing districts who were renting their dwellings. The election of 1840 was a watershed moment. Huge rallies connected with this election all across the country, without question, though, certainly in Rhode Island. The rise of a stable two-party system in the Jacksonian period led to increased efforts by political parties to seek out groups of people that had previously been locked out of the political process. Workers, laborers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates began using the Declaration of Independence to justify their quest for equality and their opposition to tyranny. From the Rhode Island Suffrage Association that was formed in this period, you can see the size of the crowd. As to why Dorr emerged as the intellectual spokesman of the common man in this particular group on screen, he was in many ways the preeminent reformer of his era in Rhode Island in the 1830s. In the economic realm, he drafted a major piece of legislation that provided for government regulation of state-chartered banks. He worked for the abolishment of imprisonment for debt. He was an ardent abolitionist and anti-slavery advocate, serving on the executive committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. He was also a leading educational reformer, pioneering the constructions of the state's first high school. By the end of 1841, he had become the leading figure once again in the Rhode Island Suffrage Association. Over a 3-day period in late December 1841, through the workings of this group, an overwhelming majority of Rhode Islanders, almost 14,000 in favor, cast a ballot for what had become known as the People's Constitution. Again, it was being driven by this organization, the convention that they held. Here are some political ribbons from the summer of 1841 that gives a sense of what the group was about. The people are the sovereign power. We will have our rights. These were ribbons that would have been worn. These are from the private collection of a dear friend of mine, Russell D. Simone, who lives in Middletown. And Russell and I authored a number of different articles together on the rebellion, along with working on the Dorr Rebellion project website. Anyone who works on Rhode Island history in the 18th or 19th century has probably talked to Rusty Simone at some point. Here's another one. I'm an American citizen. This is from a little earlier in the spring of 41. And just one more of these incredible ribbons, once again, that were worn for May. I am for a constitution and equal rights. Referring to the Suffrage Association and its intellectual spokesman, Thomas Dorr, Elijah Potter, prominent lawyer, Elijah Potter Jr., a prominent lawyer from South Kingstown, declared that those who have raised the storm may not be able, though, to govern it. Potter proclaimed his affinity for what he called the old system under the charter that granted a disproportionate amount of power to the agrarian areas of Rhode Island. But he recognized that there was a democratic tide that was sweeping the state that probably could not be turned back. It is probably settled, Potter said, that we must have free suffrage, but in what way must it be brought about? For Potter, in order for constitutional change to be legal, it had to come from the sitting General Assembly and not an extra-legal convention. Potter's argument would be adopted, and certainly by, as we get into in a moment, the Law and Order Party in Rhode Island, but also in many ways the powers in Washington and the president, as I'll come back to John Tyler in a moment, and eventually then the Supreme Court later in the year 1848. As you get into the spring, though, of 42, there were two governments in Rhode Island. One claiming legitimacy under a colonial charter that prescribed no mode for amendment. The other claiming legitimacy from a constitution adopted by the majority of citizens, but in an extra-legal plebiscite. A new political party had been created. That's an image of Elijah Potter, if you've never seen that before. And here is the man that was going into his third term as governor of the state, Samuel Ward King from Johnston. He became the nominal head of this Law and Order Party. I used to have a lot of fun with images when I was writing my book and dissertation. And there's a wonderful archivist at the Rhode Island Historical Society named JDK. And we often joke that we thought that Samuel Ward King looked like the guitarist that you might know well from the Rolling Stones. So we kind of played around a little bit with the with the images over time, because we thought he looked like Keith Richards. I did not print that one in the book, though I was tempted to do that. Perhaps sensing the divide within the ranks of the Law and Order Party, Dorr was fully confident in victory. In April, early April of 42, he wrote to Duty Pierce, his good friend in Newport, about the high level he felt of support, mainly in Providence County. He clearly expected his supporters to hold fast in the face of any type of opposition they would see from the charter government. Dorr wrote this interesting letter to Pierce. It said, "A determined defense in return for the first blow is the purpose of the people. Woonsocket," Dorr said, "had been armed and equipped with 200 men. Yesterday, another 100 men today," he told Pierce. 200 farmers were present at Lime Rock this afternoon who proclaimed themselves ready to rescue any officer of the people's government. Same for Warwick. North Providence, where I was born, my parents still live, organizes tomorrow, said Dorr. No more than 150 men of the military order can be found against us in this city, referring to Providence. The Tories, that's how Dorr referred to his political enemies, are alarmed and steering. Of course, this is a reference to pro-British sympathizers during the American Revolution. "We all go for peace," said Dorr, "but the ticket will be sustained and violence will be reluctantly repelled, but with certainty." In his letter to Pierce, Dorr noted that the state arsenal in Providence was not heavily armed. File that one away in the back of your mind for just a moment. Dorr was elected the people's governor on April 18th. On April 20th, Samuel Ward King, here on the screen, was elected to, his fourth term. I said a third a minute ago, is actually his fourth term in office. Joshua Rathburn, a resident of Tiverton, informed Dorr that the majority of businessmen would do anything and everything rather than recognize the right of the people at large to make and alter their government at will. Rathburn also outlined the nativist strategy that the Law and Order advocates were developing. When Dorr attempted to enfranchise the sizable Irish immigrant population with the liberal suffrage provisions for white males in the People's Constitution, an epidemic of nativism really infected the state of Rhode Island. Historian laureate of the state, Pat Conley, has written the most about the nativist sentiment that was so much a part of the politics of the 1840s and the 1850s in Rhode Island. There was a very famous broadside that I believe I can show you. That warned Rhode Island citizens that the People's Constitution would place your government, your civil and political institutions, your public schools, and perhaps your religious privileges under the control of the Pope of Rome through the medium of thousands of naturalized foreign Catholics. The nativist fears centering on Rhode Island Catholic priests were not the exclusive province, though, of affluent male conservatives. In summing up the difference between the two constitutions that were under debate, Aurelia Moffat, the wife of Orson Moffat, a Providence stablekeeper, wrote in her diary that the greatest difference between the two documents is that foreigners are admitted to the affairs of the state almost unconditionally in the People's Constitution, and by the other, not so they can be supposed to have some interest in its welfare. Moffat believed that the free suffrage advocates, that by the free suffrage advocates, we should be delivered up to the tender mercies of the Roman Catholic foreigners, who can be bought and sold by their employers, and were at the beck and call of their priests. So this was a significant issue. Once again, Pat Conley, the historian laureate of the state, was really the first in the 1970s to kind of bore down and explore the power of nativism in Rhode Island politics, both pre, during, post, and all the way up to the Civil War, and later in the 19th century as well, I should point out. Issues of race were very prominent, though, in this period as well, and it's one thing I dive into very heavily in my book. So in addition to fears of enfranchising Irish Catholics that were out there, Dorr's ideology at first garnered a lot of support within abolitionist circles. Dorr himself was connected to abolitionist organizations in the 1830s and played prominent roles within the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society, including serving on the executive committee. African Americans, for right reasons, looked at Dorr's ideology to say that we want to be a part of this. They looked to him for the ability to be able to bring the right of suffrage to their community. African Americans had been disenfranchised in Rhode Island since 1822. So they saw Dorr as a way to kind of claim their rights to citizenship. And I should point out, in this period, before the Dorr Rebellion and after, there was wide-ranging conversations in African-American communities at what became known as these Black convention movements all across the North in the 1830s and 40s about prerogatives and privileges and immunities of citizenship. And large-scale, conventions, multi-day, all across the North. I'm writing and working on some here in the Western Reserve area of Ohio. But a major topic was always, once again, suffrage. So African Americans in Rhode Island and white abolitionists all across New England initially had high hopes that Dorr's movement would enfranchise African Americans, that the abolitionist movement was not only concerned about ending slavery in the American South and concerned about the growth of the slave power that may be in the levers of, kind of political power in Washington. They were concerned about civil rights in the North. It's often an overlooked and forgotten. And this was a time period in which they were making arguments about who was a citizen and what rights did they have. And the Dorr Rebellion kind of fits in with that. Unfortunately, in the People's Constitution, a white-only clause over Dorr's fierce objection, was eventually bedded into the document. This leads to a significant outpouring against the People's Constitution from abolitionist circles. Dorr hoped that once in power, that he could have that clause removed, that African Americans would indeed be enfranchised under his Constitution that was drafted, once again in 1841 and in December of 41, with 14,000 Rhode Islanders supporting it. But African Americans didn't see it that way, and certainly abolitionists all across the North. So a colorful cast of characters, some very prominent abolitionists that I talk about in the book, descended upon all quarters of Rhode Island to protest against Dorr's movement, to call it racist, to label him a hypocrite for talking about the rights of the people, but to label it only for white people. So there's this interesting argument about this question of immigrants and nativists. There's a racial argument that's happening, major questions about citizenship, and women are also very active on both sides There was no hint whatsoever of women getting the right to vote in the People's Constitution, and never came up for a debate as the question of Black suffrage did. But women were very active on both sides and speaking out for and against what Dorr was doing. And it really was a transformative moment. So on the Dorr Rebellion website, we do bring the story of females quite heavily on there for teachers to look at. Rhoda Newcomb, a Providence resident who watched Dorr's inaugural procession go by her home, informed her son, Charles, a boarder actually at a utopian farm called Brook Farm, not too far away, that open warfare was on the horizon in the spring of 1842. Ripley had actually been Dorr's classmate at Harvard, and Rhoda Newcomb viewed Dorr's inauguration as an impending apocalypse. Evil, she said, permitted by divine providence in order to cleanse, she said, the state of its sins. What those sins were, she seemed to indicate, were past sins of the connection of the state to the slave trade in the 18th century. Well, certainly a sizable crowd, the parade accompanying Dorr on May 3 did not compare, though, with the crowds that had attended some of these earlier rallies of those ribbons I had mentioned in the spring and summer of 41. One reason is that support from the middle class, who had once joined with the ranks of mechanics and artisans and supported the People's Constitution, began to erode. Some of this was certainly just out of fear of arrest and perhaps apprehension over the ability for this to actually work. So apprehension for success. Local merchants loyal to the Suffrage Association were threatened, and the screws were to be put on them without mercy. Landlords turned tenants out of their houses, along with discharging some men from employment for bearing arms in defense of the people's rights. That was in a letter I was quoting there from an ally of Dorr, informing of what was happening to him as employers began to threaten their employees. Once again, these employees would largely be immigrants. On May 4th, 1842, the charter government declared what was painfully obvious to most Providence residents, that a state of insurrection existed. The General Assembly made a formal request to President John Tyler to interpose the authority and power of the United States and suppress such insurrectionary and lawless assemblages, to support the existing government laws and protect the state from domestic violence. Taking every precaution, Samuel Ward King also wrote to Governor John Davis of Massachusetts, asking him to have his state's forces stand at the ready. Davis was a prominent Whig. Weeks later, Dorr's uncles, Zachariah Allen Jr., took it upon himself to go to Boston to orchestrate actually an arms deal with the Massachusetts Adjutant General. On May 4th, Samuel Ward King, as he's celebrating his inaugural as governor under the Royal Charter, things are really starting to heat up. Dorr, taking the advice of Democratic senators in Washington who had written to him, was careful, though, at this point in early May, not to do anything that might incite violence. And he was receiving some letters, including from Levi Woodbury from New Hampshire. But of course, as some of you may know, this would not last. In writing my book on Dorr, I was struck by how true each side was to the core values it claimed to be fighting for. It was the coercive power of a recalcitrant state legislature against the potency of the revolutionary doctrine of popular sovereignty. History seldom provides us with pure embodiments of contrasting political alternatives, but in the spring of 1841, they were both on display, and the military projections of both perspectives were pretty much committed to a collision course. When reading the letters from this period, along with his opponents from Dorr's opponents, you really get a sense that they felt as if they were standing in the center of a windstorm. And kind of the currents of history itself was kind of sweeping past them. This comes out quite clearly in their letters. By mid-May, Dorr had let it be known that he had lost all patience with the moderates who were hoping for reconciliation. And there were many in his camp that were trying to bring about peace. Dorr, here in a sketch, an artistic sketch of drawing from May 16th, after he had returned from a brief trip to Washington. He did not get the support that he was looking for, but he's brandishing this sword. Dorr had no military experience or background whatsoever. The sword was given to him as he stopped off in New York, and kind of hanging out near Tammany Hall area. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York with Martin Scorsese, it would give you some sense, I think, of this time in the 19th century where Dorr was receiving support from these radical Democrats in New York and labor radicals. But he comes back kind of emboldened, but he didn't really have any any military experience that would enable him to kind of deal with troops. But it didn't stop him. As dusk turned to dark on May 17th, 1842, the residents of Providence, Rhode Island were returning to their homes, but few were preparing for a restful night's sleep. Citizens were on edge, expecting the sound of cannon fire at any moment. The shops and banks had been closed all day. The city's cobblestone streets were filled with men in uniform, from young recruits engaged in their first military drills to more senior militiamen who might have gone back all the way to the War of 1812, who had performed decades of service in these militias. At first, it was rumor and speculation, but as the night wore on, credible witnesses reported that the people's governor was planning an assault on the arsenal on the west side of the city. If this was to be his final battle, Dorr really intended to go out with a bang. Another rumor had Dorr taking the public property in Newport after he captured the state arsenal. This was actually widely spread. The impact of the late night events was quickly felt on Aquidneck Island. Edward Carrington, a member of Governor King's executive council, sent a request for troops to Newport, where the General Assembly was actually sitting at the time. At this period in Rhode Island history, the Assembly rotated from different parts of the state, including from East Greenwich, Newport, and Providence. At the early hour of 1 o'clock in the morning of Tuesday, May 18th, 1842, many of the people of Newport were aroused from their slumbers by the firing of cannon and a beat of drums, reported Colonel William Swan of the Newport Artillery. A communication arrived from Governor King to Swan with orders to muster his company without delay and embark for Providence in a steamboat, which had been dispatched for that purpose. While the Newport Artillery arrived too late to counter Dorr's forces, it did lead the charge later that day up Federal Hill to dislodge the remaining Dorrites at Burrington Anthony's home on Atwell's Avenue, which you can still see to this day. Now it became the site temporarily of Dorr's headquarters until he fled. The moment reached a crescendo in the early morning hours of May 18th. Commentators frequently referred to the state of civil commotion. Commotion, though, looked like an all-out war to many residents of the city. Providence militiaman William Bailey was convinced that Dorr was motivated only by malice and revenge. Dorr's goal, according to Bailey, was to destroy lives and property. Not taking any chances, Bailey, and this was something that many residents of Providence did, arranged for his family to leave the city. Many compared this time period to, in their letters, Providence residents, that it looked like there could be a French Revolution of sorts. Rumors circulated that after he captured the arsenal, Dorr intended to march across the city over to Brown University in order to use the dormitories as barracks for his troops. From there, it was rumored that Dorr would order his men to seize public and private property and redistribute it among the poor masses, establishing an agrarian despotism, socialism. At 2 o'clock in the morning on May 18th, alarm bells and the cry of fire began to arouse Providence's sleeping inhabitants. Dorr might have recognized the sound of the bells atop St. John's Episcopal Church in Providence, where his family owned a pew and had for many years. With the streetlamps veiled by a heavy fog rising from Narragansett Bay, Dorr's men used torches. Providence elites living in large homes on the hills of the east side that are still there to this day, including Dorr's beautiful home on Benefit Street, talked about seeing a column of flickering lights marching off into the darkness. Lydia Dorr likely watched with trepidation as her husband actually went off to defend the city, and her son, Sullivan Jr., went to join his brothers, Dorr's brothers, in the arsenal. Lydia's family, in this sense, was literally coming apart at the seams. A banner that was used in this time period, giving a sense of Dorr, I will not compromise the people's rights. Here's an image of a sketch of the arsenal and troops setting up positions. This would have been troops loyal to Dorr as they're intending to fire into the building. Image sketch of Dorr's home. I had the privilege from the late Frank Moran to enter that house many years ago and to get a tour and actually see Dorr's bedroom, where he died in that home. Mr. Moran was very kind to me as I was writing my book. and educated quite a bit about the Dorr family. 70 of Dorr's men had successfully stolen 2 6-pounder cannons in broad daylight from the United Train of Artillery in Providence. He now intended to make use of them. If Dorr's men had dragged the cannon directly to the arsenal, they probably could have taken it without firing a shot, but there was some delay. The arsenal was about a 50 by 60-foot structure with chipstone walls. It was constructed to withstand shot and shell, but its thatched roof could easily have been blown off and worse ignited, perhaps even burning those inside. The governor, King, called for additional reinforcements from the conservative coastal enclaves of Warren, Bristol, and Newport. He went to the arsenal himself to encourage men to stand their ground. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, Dorr's men had set up an encampment, and they were very close, as you saw in that image a minute ago, from the northeast wall. "It can't be possible that your brother intends to fire on this building," asked a Providence militiaman of Sullivan Jr., who was looking out the window at his older brother. "I guess you're not acquainted with the breed," young Sullivan was said to have replied. With his reduced numbers, as men began to run away in the night as they got some cold feet from standing behind Dorr, Dorr deemed it expedient to try to fire on the arsenal with cannon shot before all of his men had departed. Plan was sound, I guess, for one important detail. The men had failed to properly cover the cannon when it started to rain. The damp wicks would not light. When the cannons failed to ignite, all of Dorr's men, including Dorr, fled into the night. His uncle eventually, the next day, one of his uncles, Philip, helped him to get out of the city. Here's a headline as this became lampooned in the press. This is from the New York Herald. It says, "Killed 0, wounded 0, missing 481, scared 960, horribly frightened 789, fainted on the battleground 73, women in hysterics 22, temperance pledge broken before the battle 330, governors missing 1. But it remained a very serious issue. The Law and Order Party managed to lampoon Dorr. The sketch is a representative of Dorr as a fat Napoleon with a butter knife. But Dorr would not stop. He would eventually come back. He hid out. He went down to New York, but he would come back. And the state was still on edge all throughout the rest of May and into June. Newport County's response to Governor Samuel Ward King's call for support was significant, with every town sending militia or volunteer companies. The island is absolutely stripped of men," wrote Anne Maria Randolph to her daughter Elizabeth, who was living in Boston. In addition to the Newport Artillery Company under Colonel Swan, there were also the Newport Volunteers, Middletown Volunteers, and volunteers from Jamestown. Martial law remained in place for months in Rhode Island. Many of Dorr's followers were eventually rounded up and thrown in jail, many spending time actually in jail in Newport. As this came to an end in the month of May, in June in Chaput in northern Rhode Island, so many of these prisoners were incarcerated in Newport. The most famous episode involved the labor reformer, a voice of the common man, a man named Seth Luther. In an attempt to escape Newport's Marlborough Street jail, Luther actually set fire to his cell, got out as far as Thames Street, only to be apprehended minutes later as he had charred clothing and blackened face, obviously gave him away. But in prison, Luther wrote, we have some of this up on the Dorr Rebellion Project website, but there was a poem that he had penned dedicated to the suffrage ladies of Rhode Island entitled "The Garland of Gratitude." Women of Rhode Island became very active on Dorr's side in helping to care for these prisoners and to keep Dorr's message alive. It really fell to females. Many men were arrested or afraid to come out, afraid to be connected to the rebellion. So women organized. They organized clam bakes. Most of these clam bakes took place in Massachusetts, outside of Rhode Island, for fear of arrest. But women really, in this period, as you get into the summer and fall of 1842, after the rebellion is put down in Chaput, play a central role. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, his brother-in-law is actually Rhode Islander George Benson. Garrison is really writing quite frequently. He remains upset at Dorr for the white-only clause. He never really believed Dorr's argument that it wasn't his fault, and Dorr became actually quite angry at these abolitionists later. But Garrison was concerned about the usages of martial law and these prisoners that were wallowing, many of them in Newport. Dorr, after Chaput, flees he's out of the state again. He leaves some people hanging. There were some people that were quite angry at Dorr for this, but he goes to New Hampshire. He lives in Concord, out in the open. He becomes friends with Franklin Pierce, future president of the United States, and the governor, living in the governor's house for a while. Henry Hubbard, both of them prominent Democrats. By the fall of 1842, the charter government convened another constitutional convention, and they asked Rhode Islanders to vote on this. Although it eased suffrage requirements, the reformed constitution was a far cry, though, from Dorr's vision. It mandated a 1-year residency requirement for freeholders, a 2-year residency requirement for the native born without real estate, but owning $134 worth of personal property. Naturalized citizens were still required to own $134 worth of real estate. The rural Democrat Elijah Parter noted in a letter to former Governor John Brown Francis that the Law and Order Party was okay with having African Americans connected to this, and African Americans do, through a plebiscite after this Constitution is adopted, get the right to vote. And Potter makes it very clear, and this was true of a lot of conservatives, that they were okay with African Americans being part of the electorate, but they really wanted to keep the Irish out. So this, the Constitution was eventually approved by a lopsided margin of over 7,000 to just 51. Eventually, this provision of Black suffrage was voted in favor for 4,000 votes to 1,700. So about a 2-to-1 margin. Dorr, anti-slavery in the 1830s, and a prominent one, became very angry at the charter government for not going and bringing in naturalized citizens. Dorr actually becomes the spectrum of race and racism. Dorr begins to drift away from his earlier pronouncements, his more liberal views on race, and really becomes connected to the ideology of the Democratic Party that you would see victorious with Franklin Pierce, and then later James Buchanan. He believed that white naturalized citizens deserved the right to vote over African Americans. They deserved it first. And Dorr would not and did not say that in the 1830s, or even in the early part when he's writing the People's Constitution. So something changed for him. And I think a lot of it was very personal. He was upset at the attacks that he had been receiving from abolitionists, mainly William Lloyd Garrison in the pages of the Liberator. And he just couldn't look past it, and then kind of changed his mind about a lot of views that he had previously taken. Dorr, though, comes back to the state in late October 31st of 1843, and he spends time in prison, Newport province, but then he's put on trial in 1844, as I mentioned at the beginning of tonight, in Newport. He's eventually convicted of treason. Dorr is the first man in history to be convicted of treason against the state. John Brown is the second person to be convicted of treason against the state. Dorr is not executed, though. He spends time in Providence, state prison in Providence, a total of about 20 months incarcerated, and then he's released. He spends the remaining part of his years dying in December of 1854 in that beautiful family home on Benefit Street. Sullivan Dorr worked tirelessly for Dorr's release. Behind the scenes, he sent a confidential letter and a petition to the Speaker of the House, who at this point, come 1844, was Richard Randolph of Newport, in which Dorr was trying to get assistance for his son. I do not mean to justify my unhappy son, but I pray that a man of letters should not be caged with the lowest felons, wrote Sullivan, who went on to hint that there was something mentally wrong with Thomas Dorr. And this, in the family letters that do survive, this shows up periodically, that was Dorr unstable. Randolph replied 4 days later, stating that he had visited Dorr in jail. Randolph showed Dorr his father's petition and recommended that he take an oath of allegiance to the present state government in order to secure an immediate release. The idealistic Dorr, though, refused. According to Randolph, Dorr considered himself a martyr to a most important principle. It was impossible to help one who is not willing to help himself, said Randolph to Sullivan Dorr Sr. So he would eventually be released in 1845. His incarceration, much the thing that the Law and Order Party did not consider, became a huge issue in the presidential election of 1844. And indeed, in many quarters in the North, the tagline became Polk, Dallas, and Dorr. Dorr's imprisonment was skillfully used as a rallying cry for Democrats, and Democrats would win that election. That's a pivotal election in American history. James Polk would emerge victorious over Henry Clay. And then the question quickly becomes, during Polk's presidency, about the Mexican-American War and the question of slavery. So a pivotal moment, certainly a great historical what if Henry Clay had won that very close election. Would the Mexican-American War, certainly a catalyst on the road to the American Civil War, have actually taken place if Clay had emerged victorious? But Dorr's incarceration, his rhetoric, would be once again skillfully used by the Democrats in that election, and then his ideology of popular sovereignty would begin to play out in the 1850s over questions of settlement of the slavery question in the territories. So things that I'd like to talk about with my students on this, for the teachers on the call. A recently discovered letter that is in the collection of my good friend Russell D. Simone from a group of Rhode Island women loyal to Dorr, I think illustrates the Revolutionary era connection that's always fascinated me so much with this. As you read this, it's like a replay of the American Revolution. Was understood by both males and females. Eliza Shaw, Sarah Davis, Mary Steinus, Anne Buffington, and Marie Gardner believed that Dorr endeavored to establish a constitution based upon the principles for which our fathers bled and died in 1776. Believing as we do that the principles for which our fathers, husbands, and brothers have been contending are none other than those declared in the immortal state paper, which proved a death warrant to the British king in his attempts to impose a tax of 3 cents a pound on tea some 60 years ago, and that the longer continuance under the servile submission to a government deriving its power from a royal charter granted by that reckless wretch Charles II more than 200 years ago would stamp them with the indelible term of slaves. The Dorr Rebellion had a profound impact, I think, on the state and on the nation. Its most lasting legacy was perhaps embedded into a ruling in 1848, and that's the Luther v. Boarding case. It was also responsible, though, for bringing the state its first constitution. It really shook up, and the assembly does finally do this in 1843. It forested a reinstatement of Black suffrage. It provided for a platform for women to be involved in public political discourse, heralding the beginning of, I think, of women's suffrage movement and equal rights. It really, in many ways, you see this coming out in full force. Women, of course, and the abolitionist movement have been involved with the petitioning campaigns in the 1830s, but you really see this activism on both women associated with the Whigs and the Democrats. In this case, it certainly then was no Tempest in a teapot. It had a bigger perspective. It represents a great question of constitutional importance before the Civil War. Who were the rightful monitors of the constitutional order? Today, we take it for granted that function falls to the Supreme Court, but that question was far from clear, as many historians, legal historians, have written about in recent years, including Christian Fritz from the University of New Mexico Law School. As Fritz meticulously has laid out in his book, American Sovereigns, there were roles for Congress, the executive, and the court to play, and this relationship was often uncertain and more outside of our modern understanding, clearly compelling, I think, to Americans in the 19th century and the 18th as well, was a possibility of the role of the people. However, one conceived them as a check on unconstitutional actions. Legacy of the legacy of the American Revolution, the question of sovereignty of the people, and hot button issues in Jacksonian America, democracy, nativism, race, abolition, citizenship, the Constitution, were all part of the Dorr Rebellion. The politics that were connected in Rhode Island to the rebellion certainly affects the state as the 1840s goes on. Constitutional disputes in the 1850s and clamoring for those for Irish to be able to vote goes on into the 1850s, and the strong nativist American kind of the American movement that connected and predated the Republican Party, and this anti-Catholic sentiment really kind of would be a driving force, and you see that so clearly with the Dorr Rebellion. So I'm going to kind of end there. I want to make sure I can turn my attention now to the chat room, as I was wanted to keep this talk to about 40 minutes or so. So I went just a smidge over that, but I hope that we can stay on the call and I can have an opportunity to converse with you via the chat feature of Zoom. And happy to stay on this longer as well. So I thank you for your time tonight, and I look forward to a little Q&A.
Erik, thanks so much for sharing all of your expertise and insights. I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, but I do have a question. I was wondering if you could offer some insights into the parallels from the politics of that era to the state of affairs that we're experiencing today.
Well, thank you. As you certainly can imagine, I think as I watched, I remember on the night of January 6th, I've been a boarding school teacher for many years after graduate school. So I was living and teaching at the time at Lawrenceville in New Jersey. And after I picked my children up from school, I had came back into the dorm. I remember we didn't practice track. I'm a track and field coach. I've coached track my entire time in boarding schools, indoor and outdoor track. And I just was kind of glued to the TV in the common room as students began to flood in after classes. And we began just to kind of sit and watch these events unfold in real time. And that night I got a couple of emails. People were very curious, about this. Some journalists, were asking questions about other periods in American history. And, I've obviously written a book on an insurrection and kind of a scary moment in Rhode Island. So I was getting a lot of questions that night, kind of comparing Dorr, to the present, and in this case, obviously to what had transpired on January 6th and what was happening in Providence. At the time, I never dreamed that America would get to that point again. I think when you look at what was transpiring in Rhode Island in 1842, we are often, I think, taken by the law and order party perspective. They did a heck of a job of lampooning Dorr in a lot of images. Of course, the cannons didn't fire. And there's a lot of evidence that actually they might have been tampered with to prevent loss of life. Or it could have simply just been the rain that had started to fall and, the improper care and covering of the cannons. But nothing happened. Thankfully, there was not loss of life. Could there have been? Absolutely. Every indication was that there could have been loss of life on an attack on the arsenal, and that could have dealt with Dorr's own family. So politics had reached a real breaking point. That there was not, though people tried, there was an inability to compromise. There was an inability to find a way to deal with this, and the Dorr Rebellion had to take things that far. Eventually, then the state will, in the wake of this, adopt the Constitution. But it was a scary moment. For sure. And people, believe me, people in Providence did not think lightly of this. I mean, later there's all these funny articles and pictures of Dorr as a fat Napoleon, but anyone living at that time really thought that that this could be it, that this whole city could go up in flames, that there could be a massive riot that will, extend well beyond the west side of the city, engulf the entire city. The rumors were very powerful. They were indeed rumors, but people believed them. And they lived in fear. And cooler heads did not prevail. We and the Dorr Rebellion project team, we put up some interesting letters by Governor John Brown Francis, and he was trying to broker. There was a middle ground. He thought that things could be done. There was saner voices, if you will, but there was a lot too far on each side, and this sadly was the result of this. And so certainly for our polarized world today and the dangers of what happened on January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, where people referred to Dorr as a demagogue, that he had got people railed up and brought them over to the arsenal and what could have happened. So we certainly, there's lessons to be learned, about that, in proper procedures. To go through. I just watched the incredible interview with Mike Pence in the Mirror from ABC, talking about that night and the actions not only of Pence, and what he did to help to make sure that vote was going to take place that night. There are some heroes behind the scenes, including some of Dorr's uncles, that tried to calm things down, get him out of the state. which had an effect, but he does come back again, and he didn't know when to quit in June. A lot of them, his uncle certainly hoped he would just stay away and not come back, but he did in June, and then he goes away again, and then he's insisting on a trial. He wants his name out there. Did he ever think he could win at the trial? No, I think he knew that he was never going to win. He wasn't stupid in that regard. I think he knew who he was facing as the judge, but that trial became a way for him to be on center stage again. And in that sense, it worked quite perfectly. And his later imprisonment became a political weapon of the Democratic Party. So as I said, I did write a couple of pieces, I think, and people flat out asked me, was Dorr Donald Trump? I got that question quite a bit. I tried to shy away from answering that as much as I could at the days following January 6th. But you can see the dangers of political polarization and what that can lead to, and we're certainly living and have lived through that period now.
Actually, speaking on your kind of piggybacking on your last comment, Caroline asks, how do you assess Dorr's personal motivation and drive as ego dominant or practical / ideological?
That's a great question, Caroline. I think it's a wonderful question for students to unpack. It's that high quality of a question that you're asking there that we hope, myself and Rusty Simone, when we made the Dorr Rebellion Project website with the help of the team at Providence College, and first went live about 10 or 12 years ago now, that this is one of the central questions we wanted people to try to get at. What drove Dorr? Was he in the, I think there's a lot of comparisons, once again, you can make to John Brown, if you know anything about John Brown and his devotion to his cause and what he was willing to do, obviously. But did Brown have an ego? Sure. Did Dorr have an ego? Absolutely. I think they kind of went hand in hand. I think that's probably to a large degree which made them so dangerous, really. I was just covering today with students John Brown's relationship with Frederick Douglass. I mean, Douglass almost decided that he would go with John Brown to Harper's Ferry and backed out at the last moment. Though on Brown's person, there was a note that was found, somewhat innocuous from 2 years prior from Douglass, and that Douglass, there was a bounty put on Douglass' head. Douglass had to quickly get out of where he was in Pennsylvania. He was near Philadelphia at the time, and run back home, get his stuff, and he left the country. But Douglass almost went with Brown. He was almost hooked in. And that would have been Douglass. He certainly would have been executed, just like Brown was obviously executed. So their egos, along with their ardent belief and their ability to articulate it. And Dorr was a brilliant writer. He was a good speaker. He had a deep education and a tremendous education for that period, and he was captivating. Anyone who really knew him closely always talked about his powerful intellect. He was a brilliant writer. And he could, really, I think, bring a lot of people into his orbit, and he definitely did, which was dangerous, and people went to prison for it.
We do have one other question from Tom. He says, in your estimation, was there a more effective path that Dorr could have taken, one without the threat of violence, for example?
That's another great question. Thank you, Tom. I see there that you typed in the former educator, so thank you. This is why I'm do what I do, every day, teaching here at Western Reserve. I love my job, and I love to teach at night, as I have been for many years for Providence College. So could he have taken a different path? Yeah, I think there were some other paths. And on the Dorr Rebellion Project website, we try to get at this kind of the road not taken is how we framed it. There were some attempts, and some key figures, John Brown Francis, who in particular, former governor, who was trying to get the assembly to see a little bit of the writing on the wall, and these arch conservative Democrats in the state. The Democratic Party is an interesting thing to look at in Rhode Island, and Dorr himself, by this point in the 1840s, was a Democrat. He was previously a Whig when he was a state legislator, and certainly during his height of his anti-slavery career. But he comes to be connected to the Democrats. But Dorr is, of a branch, a more radical labor-orientated branch of the democracy, as it was known. But Rhode Island had a lot of conservative Democrats, in addition to the Whig Party. Of course, Dorr once again was a former Whig, and a lot of Whigs were reformers, and Dorr fell into that category. But John Brown Francis was trying to thread the needle, if you will, and to find a way for the assembly to call another constitutional convention, and to which they did do, and to put in it some provisions that would appease Dorr, the Suffrage Association, meet them halfway, and maybe bring them into the fold. And of course, this did not really work out. There were, once again, some hardliners on both sides. And this is where things begin to get out of hand as you get into the spring, as the Rhode Islanders then have two governors, at least two people claiming to be governor, two sitting assemblies and so forth. But there was that path we call the road not taken on the Dorr Rebellion project website. And I will stop sharing in a moment here. I'm just going to drop in that link for those on the call, so you can actually check out the website. We'd love for people to look at it. Of course, once again, it's aimed at teachers to use with students, but we've gotten some wonderful communication over the years from just researchers using the site. We're very fortunate. The link is now in the chat, so you can click on it. We're very fortunate to have so much support from different organizations in the state to keep that site going. We have Rhode Island Historical Society has been absolutely wonderful. In the early stages of this, we have some wonderful images from them. They really have been just an incredible team, and Morgan Greff's team to partner with to make that website happen. So take a look there, Tom. I think you'll see some interesting things.